Hey, let's talk media cuts. Yeah, see what I did there? Bell, let's talk media cuts. Huh. Okay, first of all, you get sporty Nora today. I'm in the middle of my soccer night, my soccer afternoon, and so I'm about to go play some soccer. And this is what I look like when I play soccer. You've heard the news by now, probably. Bell Media is massively cutting the amount of media it produces. It's part of overall cuts to the corporation, to BCE, to Bell, what we'd say Bell Canada. I heard one journalist call it Bell Canada on the air yesterday. I think that's just so charming and cute because, of course, it was Bell Canada at one point. And they are cutting 4,800 jobs. And of those jobs, a bunch of them will be within Bell Media, which is going to result in the loss of something like 40 radio stations. CTV is going to scale way back on its local news broadcasts. In fact, there will be no more noontime broadcasts anywhere in Canada except Toronto. And the only cities that will have weekend news broadcasts are Ottawa, Montreal, and Toronto. Okay, so CTV is kind of a big deal in Canada. It has massive market reach. It's in all communities all over Canada. It's the biggest private broadcaster. It's the only thing that's on the same level as the CBC. And it's also the most watched news network in Canada, too. Part of the cuts is getting rid of a show like W5, which does in-depth investigations and reports. And this is a disaster. Obviously, it's a disaster. It's part of the complete collapse of mainstream media in Canada. And a lot of people, every time these kinds of stories break, every time we hear about new massive layoffs within media in Canada, journalists, I'm not sure, like they do this collective like head scratching, like what can be done? I mean, a lot of the reaction is shock and sadness and mourning and supporting colleagues, and that's all obviously important and necessary and normal. But we are so bad about talking about the forces behind this decision, the forces behind the destruction of media within this country, and what needs to be done. So here you go. Here's a little bit of my offering to this conversation. So first of all, let's look at what happened with Bell Media. Now, Bell, as an overall company, should be very well placed to continue to produce media in Canada because it is a exceedingly and I would say disgustingly profitable company. Okay, so Bell made profit, not revenue, profit, $2.8 billion dollars in 2023. $2.8 billion dollars. Their profit is equal the total operating budget of CBC Radio-Canada. Okay, so we're talking like billions. This is not millions, this is billions. And because there's such good managers to pull such profit out, they're giving out, they've jacked the share payouts that people are going to get, so the shareholders will get more money. There's massive bonuses being given to people at the top at at the top at Bell. And at the end of the day, CTV is the one that experiences the biggest cuts to be able to make sure that this company remains as stinking rich as possible. So what is this a failure of? Well, some people will tell you it's a failure of traditional media to compete with social media. I mean, they're making tons of money, so is it really that? I don't know. Is it the failure of local markets to sustain things like television? Because is anybody watching TV anymore? Maybe it is. Maybe there needs to be a fundamental rethink in how broadcast television news is made, considering that the giant international social media platforms are always going to steal the content. We know that. So is there a way to fundamentally shift the way that media is made in this country to better interact with these platforms? You know, like maybe you're actually having to conceive of your nightly news broadcast as being a news feed, and you change it to have clips in a different way than insisting that someone sits down and watches the news for 30 minutes. Like, can we think outside of the box a little bit here? Those are possibilities. There's also questions like what makes something like TikTok exciting? Well, it's like actually lo-fi, good news, because that means cheap for large corporations. It's fast. And here's an important thing. It's relevant. And I think that one of the realities that has been laid so bare since October 7th is that media in this country isn't relevant. Canadians do not need to listen to CTV's noonday newscast to figure out what's going on in the world, because they will get a better sense of what's going on in the world if they're watching other channels. that isn't just because of how social media has changed the world in which we live. It's also because platforms like CTV and CBC and Global and so many of the other mainstream platforms will not report, especially on international issues, that in a line that is different or that challenges or that contradicts the official line that comes out of Foreign Affairs Canada. And that is disengaging people. People don't like that. So when you have a platform like W5, which is great and produces great journalism, how do you break up W5, the same kind of investigation, the same kind of resources, the same kind of journalism, into something that is more consumable today? You actually can totally do it. It might take getting a group of 17 to 25-year-olds around a table and be like, okay, here's this huge report. How would you consume it? How would you break this up and actually do something more creative with it? But no, what's more interesting for these folks is slashing and burning, because they're not interested actually in supporting Canadian news or telling Canadian stories. They are interested in extracting as much money from the market, from us, because of course Bell is making most of its money off of us. Well, not me, because I'm not with Bell, but cell phone services and television services and whatever. They need to make as much money as possible. And so there we actually get to the real problem here, which is capitalism. It's the most obvious and the most basic thing. It's just pure capitalism. And under capitalism in the 1940s and 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s and then the 90s, you could run a business like a newspaper and make tons of money because you controlled information in a different way. Now, when you don't control information in the same way, you have to change the way you do things. Just like the newspaper industry before the wars in Canada looked totally different. They were actually fully, clearly tied organs of political parties. Now, maybe we shouldn't go back there. Maybe that's not the model for 2024. But there are, of course, models for 2024 that we could be learning from, that we could be changing our ways and actually becoming relevant again. So what can we do other than maybe taking what we have and doing things differently? Some journalists will insist that we need to have paywalls and everything. I'll note that those journalists tend to be at like the Globe and Mail, where their paywall works, where their readership has money, probably has to subscribe to these things because they're in an executive position or they're a management position and they have to know what's going on, right? So paywalls will work for the Globe and Mails of the world. They're not going to work for the smallest newspapers in communities where people don't have the money or the interest to sustain them. So what's the solution? There are multiple solutions, but I think that the most interesting possibility for me has to be something that does not rely on the capitalist system to create news. It cannot. Capitalism right now means that you are competing against the TikToks and the Instagrams of the world. And you cannot compete against them with the traditional media model. We know that. That's couldn't be more obvious right now. So one of the things that I think we need to experiment with is creating a dedicated municipal fund, a dedicated municipal levy that is not touchable by the politicians, that is managed by a board that is elected and maybe appointed with people like your chief public librarian and maybe a representative from who cares, like whatever, your local people, and they manage the money to create a local news organ. It's a model that exists on most campuses in Canada. It's how the campus press is funded, a student-paid levy to pay for student news. And there's no real reason why this can't happen in Canada other than a lack of political courage and vision and just trying to make it happen, to just try it out, see if it's possible. Now, I wrote about this. I'll put the link right here. You can read the article. It was actually the article. It got rejected when I had a column at the Maple. It was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I was like, I'm out of here. Like, I can't believe you're rejecting this piece. But my editor there didn't think it was super compelling. So maybe you don't think it's super compelling either. Whatever. But I think it's worth considering in some communities, for sure, especially communities where there is not going to be any way to make money off of covering municipal council or off of covering police corruption or local crime or whatever it is. We need a dedicated revenue stream, and it cannot be just paywalls. My God, can we get more creative than paywalls? I can't just keep paying for subscriptions for everything, folks. Like, isn't my local news enough? Isn't my local news and one national news and some magazines enough? Like, how far are we expected to pay for this stuff on an individual basis? We can't be expected to pay for it like that. And so we have to really, 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 really reject everything about how we've run media in this country in the last 80 years, because that is a model that is tied to a liberal democracy that does not exist anymore in Canada, and it's never coming back. It's never coming back. I also wrote an essay about this for the Dalton Camp Award, which also lost. So again, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I'm just so right. They just can't understand it. I don't know. So when we're thinking through the new models and we put profit aside, all of a sudden interesting possibilities pop up. And then you can imagine like local news hubs being tied to the local public library, right? Actually doing literacy and teaching people how to read and to write and to think and to analyze. Maybe local news groups also have an events wing where you're helping to plan or host, not plan necessarily, maybe you do the whole thing, I don't know. You host local events, you're hosting weddings, or you're hosting banquets, right? You can make money off of that if you have to subsidize the rest of your operations. Maybe it's like getting involved with some sort of local company or groups of companies that pool their money together. I don't know. Like wherever you are in Canada, you're going to have different local realities. The thing that's going to be constant is that the local politicians will not want the extra scrutiny. The cops will not want the extra scrutiny. Some of the companies will not want the extra scrutiny. So the opposition to this is massive, and they will always frame their opposition in a way that sounds maybe like it makes sense, but then you have to break through that logic. And this is where we are, right? So we've got an industry that's full of cowards, sorry, journalists, which you are, and very few abilities to try things in a different way. You know, shout out to the Winnipeg Free Press that's still operating and trying to figure out how to become sustainable. There's the CN2I cooperative that has 6 daily newspapers in Quebec, including my local newspaper, which just killed its circulation, which is just so devastating, and I'm so mad about it, but they're still in operation. Okay, fine, we still have something. So there are interesting experiments happening, but we need different and more and as much as possible. And we need to clearly and loudly say that we have to break with the capitalist logic on the models of media, because it does not work. It doesn't work. Because the second that a company says, you know what, fuck it, this is not working for us, we actually want out of the business of news, then it's gone. And it's gone. And then the whole argument that news loses money, it disappears when the profits are $2.8 billion. We can't rely on Bell, Rogers, Galen Weston, Suncor. Can't rely on any of these people. Can't rely on the Royal Bank. Can't rely on TD. Like, we cannot rely on the oligarchs in this country to fund information, obviously. And I think if we're not going to wake up to that reality now, then honest to God, we might as well just quit and find jobs doing communications for like national defense.